Have you ever wondered why the human heart is so often drawn, as if by an unseen force, to the very person who seems destined to cause it the most profound pain? Why in the landscape of modern relationships, a particular painful drama plays out with such relentless frequency? It is the dance of the pursuer and the pursued, a magnetic, almost fateful collision of two souls. One yearns for closeness, for the reassurance of presence, and feels a rising panic in the silence. The other craves space, feels suffocated by the very connection the first desires, and finds a strange peace in distance. This isn't merely a mismatch of personalities or bad dating luck. It is a deep, archetypal pattern, a psychological labyrinth where two worlds are clashing beneath the surface. To understand this trap, one must look not to the surface-level events, the unanswered texts, the arguments, the tearful reconciliations, but to the invisible blueprint within the psyche, the clay from which our capacity to love was first molded. This blueprint, what modern psychology calls an attachment style, is forged in the crucible of our earliest experiences. It is here we learn the fundamental language of connection, a lesson that echoes throughout our adult lives. A child whose needs are met with consistency and warmth learns that connection is safe, that the world is a secure base from which to explore. But what if that care was inconsistent? What if love and attention felt like a flickering light, present one moment and gone the next? That child learns a different lesson. They learn that connection is precarious, something that must be constantly monitored, guarded, and fought for. This is the genesis of the anxious blueprint. A person carrying this internal map moves through the world with a hyper-vigilant heart. They are masters at detecting the slightest shift in emotional temperature, the smallest sign of withdrawal from their partner. This isn't a flaw, it is a highly developed skill born of necessity. But in an adult relationship, this skill becomes a source of torment. They reach for their partner not just out of love, but out of a deep, unconscious need to quell the storm of anxiety within. Their pleas for reassurance, their constant texts, their desire to talk it out, these are not attempts to control, but desperate bids to secure a connection that feels fundamentally unstable. From a Stoic perspective, they have committed a cardinal error. They have handed the key to their inner tranquility to another person. Their peace is contingent on an external, the partner's response. As Epictetus would warn, they are enslaved to that which they do not control. This desperate reaching is also a form of projection. They see in the partner a promise of the security they do not yet possess within themselves, projecting their own unintegrated need for a stable inner ground onto another, fragile human being. They are asking their partner to be the rock, unaware that the only true rock must be cultivated within their own soul. The feeling of being too much is the painful symptom of this externalization, the shame that arises when one's own inner world feels so dependent on another's validation. On the other side of this fateful pairing stands the avoidant partner, a figure often misunderstood as cold, aloof, or uncaring. Theirs is a different kind of wound. They likely learned in their formative years that emotional needs were a liability. Their expressions of vulnerability may have been met with dismissal, discomfort, or an empty room. The lesson they internalized was brutal and clear. Self-reliance is survival. Emotions are messy, unpredictable, and dangerous. True safety lies within a fortress of one's own making. They become masters of self-regulation through distance. This can look, from the outside, like a form of Stoic strength, but it is a brittle imitation. The Stoic sage, like Marcus Aurelius, examines his emotions with reason and accepts them as part of nature. The avoidant individual does not examine them, they flee from them. When the anxious partner moves closer with their raw, intense emotionality, the avoidant partner doesn't perceive it as love. To their nervous system, it feels like an invasion, a threat of engulfment that promises to shatter their carefully constructed peace. Their retreat into silence is not a malicious act of punishment, but a reflexive, desperate move to protect their inner world from what feels like an overwhelming flood. They crave space not to be cruel, but to breathe, to feel their own edges again. Unknowingly, they are also engaging in a profound act of projection. The emotional depth and vulnerability of the anxious partner represent the very parts of themselves they have disowned, their own. Anima, their capacity for deep feeling, which they have locked away in the shadow of their psyche. They are both drawn to and terrified by this reflection of their own unlived life. They feel caged, not by their partner, but by the specter of their own repressed emotions. And so they pull away, seeking a barren peace, mistaking emotional isolation for the inner citadel of the wise. They do not realize that in fleeing from connection, they are fleeing from the very work required for their own wholeness, their own process of individuation. These two blueprints, one of desperate seeking and the other of desperate flight, set the stage for a tragic, repeating dance. And so the dance begins. It rarely starts with a thunderclap, but with a subtle shift in the music, a beat missed. The avoidant partner, feeling the press of the world or the faint stirrings of their own walled-off emotions, instinctively seeks the sanctity of their inner fortress. It might be a delayed reply, a moment of emotional distance during a conversation, a quiet withdrawal into their own thoughts. To an outside observer, it is nothing. But to the anxious partner, whose entire nervous system is an instrument tuned to the frequency of connection, it is a deafening silence. Their inner alarm, honed by a lifetime of perceived abandonment, sounds a piercing note of panic. This is the first movement, the chase. Driven by a compulsion to restore equilibrium, they reach out. A text, then another. An offer to talk, a question laced with urgency. Are you okay? This is their protest, their attempt to pull their partner back from the edge of the void. But for the avoidant, this pursuit is not seen as an act of love. It feels like an encroachment, a siege upon the walls of their solitude. Each message is a stone thrown against their defenses, each question a demand that breaches their sovereignty. The feeling is one of being caged, overwhelmed, and suffocated by the very emotionality they have spent a lifetime trying to contain. This pressure leads inevitably to the second movement, the withdrawal. To escape the feeling of engulfment, the avoidant partner does the only thing they know how to do to feel safe. They pull away completely. They become a ghost in the machine, growing distant, silent, and avoiding the real conversations that feel like traps. For the anxious partner, this is the moment the floor gives way. The initial fear blossoms into a full-blown crisis of the soul. This is the primal fear of abandonment made manifest. It is a wound that cuts deeper than mere loneliness. It is an assault on their very sense of self-worth. Every unanswered call, every read receipt without a reply, becomes proof of a terrifying inner verdict. I am not enough for them to stay. You start to scan every past interaction, every word, every silence, searching for the mistake you must have made. The truth, a truth that is both painful and liberating, is that the withdrawal is rarely about something you did wrong. The avoidant partner is not withdrawing because of your unworthiness. They are withdrawing because they do not know how to stay when emotions get real. But in that moment of panic, you begin to shrink yourself, to believe that if you could just be less, want less, feel less, you might keep them from living. You start to abandon yourself in the hope that they will not abandon you. Out of the cold silence of this withdrawal, the third movement emerges, the imbalance. In the empty space left by the avoidance retreat, the anxious partner feels a profound and solitary responsibility to repair the rupture. It is here that the relationship becomes starkly one-sided. You find yourself becoming the sole engine of the connection, sending loving messages into a void, making hopeful plans that are met with lukewarm responses or non-committal silence. You are the one who initiates the difficult conversations, pleading for understanding, only to be met with a gentle refusal. Let's talk another time. That another time stretches into an agonizing infinity while you suffer in the present. You become the lone actor in an emotional play, performing your heart out to an empty seat. This isn't just about effort, it's about emotional labor. You carry the weight for two, trying to manage your own anxiety while also trying to coax a feeling, any feeling, from a partner who has retreated behind a wall of indifference. Their silence becomes an unspoken declaration. My comfort in this space is more important than your need to connect. This lopsided dynamic naturally creates the fourth movement, a chronic and exhausting instability. Because the connection is never secure, every interaction becomes a gamble. The avoidant partner, having regulated themselves in solitude, might return, suddenly warm and open. This intermittent reinforcement is incredibly powerful, offering a rush of relief that makes the anxious partner forget the pain of the preceding silence. But the underlying tension never dissolves. The relationship becomes a shifting terrain where you are never sure of your footing. Will you be greeted with warmth today, or with that familiar, impenetrable wall? This constant oscillation between connection and distance leaves you in a maze of self-doubt, always on high alert, unable to predict their thoughts or feelings. The Stoic ideal of ataraxia, or inner peace, becomes an impossible dream. Your emotional state is perpetually tethered to their unpredictable fluctuations. Trust cannot grow in this shifting soil. It erodes with every cycle, undermining any belief in a shared, stable future. You are not building a life together. You are simply trying to survive the weather patterns of another person's inner world. After enough turns of this torturous wheel, the dance devolves into its final, most destructive form, emotional toxicity. The well of patience and understanding runs dry, leaving behind a sludge of resentment and unspoken grievances. The dynamic is no longer about a simple mismatch of needs. It has morphed into a battle. Every word becomes a potential weapon, every gesture a fresh wound. Your sincere attempts to explain your feelings are met with veiled sarcasm or a cold, detached dismissal. Their need for space is no longer expressed as a simple request, but as a cutting accusation. You always exhaust me. The shared space, once a potential sanctuary, becomes an arena of emotional warfare where there are no winners, only casualties, and trust is left in ashes. What is most insidious about this stage is how it normalizes itself. You begin to accept the verbal attacks, the crushing declarations, and the emotional deprivation as just part of the relationship. The love you once shared has been transmuted into a cycle of harm, a feedback loop of pain where both the anxious and avoidant partners are trapped in the darkest expression of their unhealed wounds, wielding their pain as both a shield and a sword. When the smoke clears from this emotional battlefield, one is left standing in the ruins, exhausted and drained, having lost the strength to nourish hope. It is at this juncture, this point of profound despair, that the real work begins. For the Stoic and for the soul-seeking wholeness, this is the moment of ultimate choice. The cycle itself, the other person's reactions, their wounds, their fears, is an external. It is outside of your direct control. But your response, your next move, is entirely within your power. Here, the path forks. One way leads toward the arduous process of healing together, the other, toward the courageous act of healing apart. Neither path is easy, but both demand one thing above all, a radical commitment to self-respect. The first path, the path of healing together, is not for the faint of heart. It can only be walked if both partners are willing to turn and face the disowned parts of themselves, to do the sacred labor of shadow work. It requires a mutual agreement to end the war and begin the excavation. For the anxious partner, the work is to build the inner citadel that they have been seeking in another. This means learning the discipline of self-regulation. When the wave of panic rises, The task is not to immediately reach for a phone, but to sit with the feeling. To observe it as a Stoic would observe a passing cloud, to acknowledge its presence without becoming it. It is to ask, what is this feeling asking of me? Often the answer is a need for inner safety, not outer reassurance. It means transforming your communication from a plea for validation into a clear statement of reality. The phrase "I feel anxious" ceases to be an accusation and becomes a simple declaration, a starting point for responsible connection, not a demand for rescue. For the avoidant partner, the work is equally profound. It is the courageous journey into the very emotional landscape they have fled. Their task is to slowly, deliberately lower the drawbridge to their fortress. This means practicing the art of leaning in. It is consciously choosing to stay in a conversation for 5 minutes longer than is comfortable. It is the practice of identifying and naming one feeling a day, no matter how small. As Seneca would advise practicing poverty to rob it of its fear, the avoidant partner must practice vulnerability to strip it of its perceived threat. Their greatest act of love is not a grand emotional display, but a proactive and rational communication of their need for solitude. A simple, "I need some space to process, but I will come back to this conversation tonight," is a revolutionary act. It replaces the destructive silence with a respectful boundary, offering the anxious partner the one thing they truly need: predictability and the death of uncertainty. This shared work, whether aided by therapy or a mutual study of these dynamics, is the process of individuation in action, withdrawing the projections and finally learning to give to oneself what was once demanded of the other. But there is another path. Sometimes one partner is ready to do the work, but the other is not. Sometimes the damage is too deep and the toxicity has become the very air you breathe. In these moments, the most courageous and self-respecting choice is the second path, the path of healing apart. This is not an act of failure. It is an act of ultimate self-preservation. It is the recognition that you cannot force another person to begin their journey of healing. To continue trying is to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. So when is enough truly enough? When there is a consistent refusal to even acknowledge the problem, when discussions about the dynamic are always met with defense or blame, when emotional toxicity has devolved into verbal attacks and contempt, and your sincerity is consistently devalued. When you look in the mirror and no longer recognize the person you have become, hollowed out by the constant anxiety and instability. To choose to leave under these circumstances is the ultimate Stoic act. It is to fully accept what is outside your control, the other person's choices, and to reclaim absolute power over what is yours, your mind, your dignity, and your peace. Setting this final, definitive boundary is not selfishness. It is a fundamental right to be treated with respect. It is a declaration that your well-being is not negotiable. You are not abandoning a relationship. You are refusing to continue abandoning yourself. In doing so, you break the chains of suffering and open the door to new possibilities. You create the necessary space to meet someone willing to journey alongside you with love and respect, not with verbal weapons. Most importantly, through this act, you will realize the most profound truth, that love should never feel suffocating. True connection does not require you to trim your needs or mute your emotions. It should grant you safety, respect, and the freedom to flourish as your whole, complete self. The journey is not about finding the right person, but about becoming the person who no longer needs to be saved. It is about building your own inner citadel, stone by stone, so that you can engage with the world not from a place of fear and lack, but from a place of strength, wholeness, and unshakable self-worth.